Today we're talking about composition and finding unity in our lines and shapes. We're going to be doing a landscape painting, which I think is a good way to practice composition and learning to abstract your lines and shapes to kind of find that unity in your picture. Painting clouds is a good way to do that because the forms of the clouds can be pretty loose and you can pick them up and move them around and stretch and squish them into whatever shape serves your composition. So I'm starting out with an underpainting again, a tonal underpainting using burnt sienna and lots of Gamsol. I like having a warm underpainting beneath all the colors I'm going to be putting on top of this later, but ultimately what matters about the underpainting is that you're just thinking about value, edge, and composition. We don't introduce any other colors just yet, just so we can focus on those three things. You can see that I'm using a rag, kind of like an eraser, to lift that paint out, revealing that blank canvas underneath, acting as a light source. But this tonal underpainting is basically a drawing with paint. I just want to set up my composition and put everything in the right place before I worry about color. So looking at the reference, everything in the sky is bright and warm. Everything on the ground is dark and cool. So I'm going to start off mixing this dark green for the bushes on the ground. This is just going to set me up to really understand my values, knowing that everything happening up in the sky is going to be much brighter than this. These bushes on the ground are a lot darker and a lot cooler. So I'm starting my painting with that for that reason. I also think it'll help just to literally ground the painting. But like I was saying earlier, I chose this reference to think about composition because with clouds you can really move them around and be loose about where you're placing every little form that you see, and you can get kind of creative with not just the forms within the cloud, but the positive and negative space of the cloud's relationship with the sky. So right now I'm painting the sky. I'm going in kind of using the background to cut out the foreground, using the negative space to define the positive space of the cloud itself. But as we use lines and shapes to carve up our picture plane at this stage in the painting, we're thinking about light versus dark and positive versus negative. I'm thinking about warm and cool a little bit, but it's more about those first two dualities that I mentioned. The three elements that we're working with are the sky, the cloud, and the ground plane. That's why I like looking at Edgar Payne's paintings and his compositional sketches, because he can really show you how he's not just copying what he's seeing in front of him, he's using those elements in front of him to make a painting. It's more of a translation than a perfect copy. So even though we're working from a photo, I'm still just going to use those clouds and sky and the bushes that I'm seeing to arrange the shapes on the canvas in a way that's compelling to me. I have a pretty good idea of where all these shapes are going to land, but part of this process is figuring it out on the canvas. So I mix that really light, bright orange, pinkish color as the light shape for the cloud, and now I'm going to go in and make a shadow shape for the cloud. But what's really important here is that the shadow part of the cloud is still very, very bright compared to everything else around it, compared especially to the cool green on the ground. The shadows of the clouds are very, very bright. There's so much light up in the sky that the clouds can't get that dark. So whether you're following along with this same reference of the clouds or if you're painting from a reference of your own, make sure you look at the shadows in the cloud shape and compare them to something darker that you're seeing on the ground. One thing I see in student work a lot when they're painting really dynamic clouds like this is that the shadows get too dark. Especially if you're toning your paint, if you're trying to create shadows, if you're doing that using black or a really, really dark gray, it's going to flatten out your clouds. You want to find that dimension, but still compress your values. So when I look at the cloud and I squint, it's really hard to tell the difference between light and dark, or light and shadow. That's because the shadow is so bright. And that's why I like having such a dark shape of the bushes on the ground to give context to those shadows. And now mixing up more color for the sky in the background. Oh no, sorry, I'm mixing a darker color for the clouds here. A little bit darker and a little bit cooler, using a little bit of alizarin crimson. So that light shape in the cloud is very light and bright and warm. As it gets darker, it gets a little bit cooler, kind of leaning more towards alizarin crimson and purple, but still in the context of that dark cool on the ground, still pretty light and warm. So think about how you can bracket your colors depending on how they all relate to each other. And within the context of the cloud itself, this color here would be a darker, cooler shadow, but compared to the dark green on the ground, it's still pretty light and bright and warm. Whatever system you find for your clouds that you're painting, try and stick to it. Compared to the donut that we painted last week, that the light source was very close and direct and powerful. When we're painting clouds like this, the light source is the sun itself, which is very, very far away in space, right? So all the light is affecting the whole cloud in a pretty similar way. There's no cast shadow edge that's going to fall off as it gets further from the light source. The difference in the distance from the light source and the different parts of the cloud are pretty negligible because the sun is so far away. I hope that makes sense. Remember to reorganize your palette. Keep everything clean. If you understand your palette, you're going to understand your painting a lot better. So now I've mixed up a little bit more of the sky color, and I'm going to use that to go in and kind of redefine the foreground by painting in the background. And experiment with the shape of your cloud. Remember, it doesn't have to match your reference perfectly. What matters is your painting. The viewer of your painting is probably never going to see the reference. And it's just important for you to know that you're in control of your own painting. I like painting clouds like this because you can act almost as wind or a force of nature yourself, kind of moving the clouds and putting them where you want them to go. So if you've ever seen a time-lapse video of clouds kind of moving across the horizon, especially during a storm, it's lots of dynamic movement, and I feel like painting clouds feels It feels pretty similar to that. Most of the sky is pretty much the same. There's a really, really subtle gradient as it gets closer to the horizon. I feel like the sky tends to get a little bit brighter and warmer depending on the time of day. It's very, very subtle though. But just be consistent with your sky color in the background. So here I'm trying to push the color in the form shadow of the cloud as it transitions from light to dark or light to shadow. It's where a lot of the color comes out a little bit brighter, so I'm trying to push that now. And with each brush stroke, I'm creating or destroying forms and shapes. And I'm kind of deciding what kind of edges I want each little piece of the cloud to have. If there's something in the reference that's useful to me, I'll use it for the painting, but if I'm also allowing myself to just be free to ignore it too. The further I go in this painting, the less I'm looking at the reference photo. Which I think is a good sign, because then it's really becoming your own thing and not just a copy of a photo. So if you look at my palette, I'm still following that system I talked about last week of going from light to dark and warm to cool. Even though my values are really compressed here, so I'm kind of spreading them out in a little bit larger pattern, I'm still trying to place my colors in the right spot on the palette every time I mix one. So this one is still darker and cooler compared to the light shape of the cloud. So I have it in that lower left corner of my palette. Well, in this video, my palette is rotated on its side. So I'm using these colors that are pretty similar to the sky itself to get into the shadows, like under the main chunk of that cloud. I really like when the shadow of the cloud is very similar to the color of the sky behind it, and I'm kind of merging the two, and it's not even totally clear what's empty space in the sky and what is the cloud. So that's what I'm mixing here. I'm kind of just leaning into that gray area between the two. Really subtle changes from warm to cool and light to dark. But again, that's why I like painting clouds. You can be very abstract and still very real, and just sort of sculpt this cloud shape out of thin air. But I'm using the photo, I'm using the system that kind of created it. The way the sun is hitting this cloud led me to these colors, and now I can kind of take them and plug them in wherever I want to, and whatever is gonna serve my composition the best, which is ultimately, it's up to me, not my camera when I took the photo. Remember when you take a picture with your camera, that you're going to use for a painting reference, your camera doesn't know you're trying to make a painting. And the difference between you and your camera is really important. If you ever find yourself getting lost and you don't really understand where you are in your painting, where you are in your palette, it's time to clean off your palette and reorganize it, and also step back from your painting. Look at the whole picture. It's very, very important to make a habit out of that. Especially if you're sitting down, it can be really hard to back up from your painting. I always stand at my easel when I paint because it's easy for me to back up, and you're not seeing that in this video. But every few paint strokes, I'm taking a few steps back and looking at the whole painting. We can't ever see the individual brushstrokes that we're making and the whole painting in the same moment. We have to go back and forth. That's the only way we can see both. So the more often that you do that, the better you're going to understand what it is that you're doing. You're going to understand your composition as a whole and how it's evolving over time. But if you find that you get really zoomed into one area, especially if it feels like it's getting really detailed and you're looking really closely and then you back up and it's not really what you thought it was, that means you're not backing up enough and looking at the whole picture enough. And for this exercise especially, try and back up and see the whole painting as often as possible. This painting is like a shape game. We want to put all the lines and shapes in the right place to find that pictorial unity that we're after. But still being aware of value and temperature, like we talked about last week. Half the battle is mixing the paint to be the right kind of paint. The other half of the battle is putting it in the right place. Try to be really conscious of your edges too. As you build up all these different forms, think about, is this a smoother edged form shadow? Is this a sharper plane change going right up against the sky behind it? So there's some paint strokes here that are really thick where I'm really trying to push a sharper edge to show a quicker plane change. And then the smoother edges are going to feel a lot rounder and slower, going from light to dark. So I'm just cleaning off and reorganizing my palette again here. Every time it gets a little too chaotic, I'm going to take the time to clean off my palette. It's totally worth taking that time to do that. Because now you can see I have a pretty good understanding of that transition from light to dark and warm to cool. The way my palette is set up right here is it's a reflection of everything happening in my painting. So I'm pushing those light shapes a little bit lighter and brighter and revisiting some of those things that I started out with. One thing you might not be seeing in this video, in addition to the amount of times I'm stepping back and looking at the whole painting, is how clean I'm keeping my brushes. Every brushstroke I'm putting down, I try to have a lot of intention with it, and so I try to keep my brushes really clean too. I don't use a lot of brushes. I think this painting I used maybe just the one brush. But I'm cleaning it so often because every time I'm putting a brushstroke down, each brushstroke has a specific purpose. I'm also not really mixing with my brush. Sometimes I do, but the more you use a palette knife to mix your paint, it forces you to have more intention with what paint you're using and why. And that doesn't mean you're going to end up with a stiff robotic painting because you're paying attention to your materials. It's just you're going to have more control over your materials. There's less variables. So there's less room for you spinning your wheels and not really knowing what you're doing. Okay, so here I'm using a different brush. This is I think it's a sable brush. It's like soft and flat compared to the rougher bristle brushes. So I'm using that to smooth out edges of the paint that got a little bit too thick. Because if the whole painting is painted really thick, then kind of maybe none of it will seem thick. So having that contrast is going to help give a lot more depth to my edges and the way it's painted. Remember, there's different kinds of contrast. Contrast doesn't necessarily have to be light versus dark. You can have contrast in temperature, contrast in edges. Here I'm trying to have contrast in the amount of paint on the surface of the painting. So I'm smoothing some of it out to give it that softer, cloudy feel, and then I'm balancing that out with a couple of thicker brush strokes to really push those sharper edges. So I went back to the bristle brush for those. And then I'm back with the softer brush again. So whenever you're like finessing those edges, it takes a lot of back and forth. I could stand there for hours deciding exactly where and how these edges are getting softer or harder using those different brushes. Because again, I'm not even really trying to copy the photo at this point. I'm trying to decide what's going to best suit my composition. So don't rush that part. Also know that this video is sped up a little bit. I'm not actually mixing that fast. Otherwise it'd be a very long video. So here I mixed remember that green was acting as a cool dark, so I went even cooler and even darker still. A little bit less saturated than that previous green because I added in a little bit of alizarin crimson. And just like with the cloud, I'm going in and kind of picking and choosing my edges. Where are the softer edges going to be and the harder edges? I'm not trying to paint any exact bush the way that I'm seeing it, or tree. It's more of a summary of those things and I'm trying to translate them into paint and into brush strokes, using the brush strokes that are sort of revealed against that burnt sienna from that initial pass that I had, balancing those with the thicker paint sitting on top. And it's almost like I'm trying to sculpt these trees and bushes out of paint, as much as I'm trying to represent them in a 2D sense in a picture. But that's just how I like to paint. If you want to go in and paint every tree on the branch, there's nothing wrong with that either. Or sorry, every leaf on the branch. I think I said that wrong. It depends on what you want to do. So here I'm kind of going back and forth, trying to balance ultramarine blue, cadmium yellow, and alizarin crimson to get the right dark, cool, leafy shadow tone. And every brush stroke I'm putting down here, I'm also thinking, like, what is this doing to the clouds? Even though I'm not painting the clouds themselves right now, this paint I'm putting down is going to change how those clouds are seen, because I'm putting a darker shape next to them. And the bushes themselves, I'm creating more depth within them. I'm basically doing the same thing I started with. I'm balancing positive and negative space and light and dark, and adding in a little bit of temperature swings here and there. But keep it simple and just try and have intention with every brushstroke that you're making. And keep stepping back and looking at the whole big picture.